My name is Alexandra Thompson, and I used to be the black sheep of my family until they discovered who I really was. I stood there in my grandmother's vintage lace wedding dress in the spacious ballroom of Barton Creek Country Club. The lighting was warm and inviting, with white and blue flower arrangements adorning every table. A band played gentle melodies in the corner, creating the perfect atmosphere for what should have been the happiest day of my life. Approximately 180 guests were seated throughout the room, all dressed in their finest attire, their faces glowing with anticipation and joy. The air buzzed with quiet conversation and the gentle clinking of champagne glasses. My fiancé, Tyler, sat in the front row, looking absolutely handsome in his navy blue suit. He worked as an engineer for ExxonMobil and came from one of the most respected, wealthy families in Texas. For the past 6 months, he had been like a beacon of light in what everyone believed was my troubled existence. My father, Jim, a retired firefighter with a distinguished gray beard and warm brown eyes, sat beside my mother, Linda. Linda served as a principal at the local elementary school, and as usual for any significant family moment, she was already dabbing tears from the corners of her eyes. She had always been emotional during important celebrations, and today was no exception. My sister Sarah sat just a few feet away, and her presence commanded attention in a way that felt oddly out of place. She wore her state trooper uniform, which seemed unusual for a family gathering of this magnitude. At 30 years of age, Sarah had achieved the remarkable distinction of becoming the youngest police inspector in Texas state history. She possessed striking brown hair, sharp angular features, and an undeniable aura of authority that seemed to follow her wherever she went. In our small community of Dripping Springs, Sarah was regarded as something of a local hero. She had received multiple Officer of the Year awards and was frequently featured in the local newspaper for her outstanding service. Her boyfriend Derek, an ambitious assistant district attorney, sat beside her wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. In that perfect moment, surrounded by everyone I loved, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over me. Everything seemed to align beautifully, like pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. The reception had been progressing wonderfully. We had enjoyed delicious appetizers and toasted with champagne that sparkled in our glasses. The band had been playing beautiful melodies that filled the room with warmth and romance. My father had delivered a deeply moving speech about how proud he was of me, and how happy he felt to see me finding love and stability with Tyler. My Uncle Tom had shared some amusing stories from mine and Sarah's childhood that had the entire room erupting in genuine laughter and fond remembrance. But I noticed that Sarah had not been laughing along with everyone else. When the Master of Ceremonies asked if anyone else would like to offer a few words, Sarah suddenly rose from her seat with a determination that immediately caught everyone's attention. "I would like to say something," she announced, her voice crystal clear and carrying the unmistakable tone of authority that came from years of law enforcement training. A momentary hush fell over the room. This had not been part of the planned program, and everyone could sense that something unexpected was about to unfold. I watched as she walked purposefully toward the microphone. Her stride was straight and commanding, exactly what you would expect from someone who had spent years maintaining order and demanding respect. This was quintessentially Sarah. Sarah always knew how to command a room. Sarah always knew how to capture everyone's complete attention. Distinguished guests, neighbors, and fellow members of our law enforcement community. Sarah's voice rang out crisp and clear through the sound system, even more piercing when amplified. "Today I want to talk to you about my sister Alexandra." The room fell into complete silence. Everyone in attendance was well aware of the stark differences between the Thompson sisters, and they all leaned forward in their seats, anticipating either some kind of dramatic revelation or perhaps one of those patronizing speeches filled with condescending forgiveness. Sarah's gaze swept across the crowd before finally settling directly on me. Her face wore what appeared to be a sweet, sisterly smile, but I could see that this expression never quite reached her eyes. "As her sister," Sarah began, "and more importantly, as a sworn officer of the law dedicated to upholding justice and maintaining order in our community, I must acknowledge a very difficult truth that has been weighing heavily on my heart." She paused deliberately, allowing the tension to build throughout the room in a way that felt calculated and intentional. "Over the past 18 months, Alexandra has brought considerable concern to our family. I should say that she has caused us significant distress and worry." I could see my mother's face beginning to drain of all color as she realized where this speech might be heading. "Alexandra," Sarah continued, her tone shifting to what sounded like genuine concern but felt somehow hollow. "You have been disappearing mysteriously for days at a time. You have no steady employment that any of us can identify. You have been associating with individuals who frankly frighten us and cause us grave concern about your well-being and safety. As a law enforcement professional, I have witnessed far too many young people completely destroy their lives by making terrible choices. Drugs, criminal activity, and sometimes even worse consequences follow those who choose the wrong path in life." Several murmurs of agreement and sympathy rippled through the crowd, and I could feel the atmosphere in the room shifting dramatically. "Bless her heart," whispered Mrs. Higgins, who lived next door to our family home, shaking her head with what appeared to be genuine sadness. In Southern culture, this particular phrase often carries the most cutting criticism disguised as compassion. It implies pity for someone's unfortunate circumstances while simultaneously expressing a subtle but unmistakable form of condescension. I have often wondered whether my sister had become involved with drugs or other dangerous criminal elements that could explain her erratic behavior and mysterious lifestyle. Sarah continued with another dramatic pause that felt rehearsed and deliberate. The energy in the room completely transformed. What had begun as a celebration was rapidly becoming something that felt more like a trial. Joy was being replaced by a heavy sense of judgment and disappointment. "But I have never given up hope for her," Sarah said, her voice now filled with what sounded like genuine love and understanding, exactly the tone that a caring sister should display in such circumstances. "Because no matter what Alexandra has done or what mistakes she may have made, she will always be my sister, and I will always love her unconditionally." And just when I feared that it might be too late for redemption, Sarah's face brightened with what appeared to be genuine relief and gratitude. Tyler appeared in her life like an answer to our prayers. Tyler shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly confused by the direction this speech was taking and uncertain about his role in whatever was unfolding. "Tyler has given me hope that I had not felt in years. For the first time in a very long time, I actually believed that perhaps Alexandra could find her way out of whatever dark path she had been walking down." Sarah raised her champagne glass high above her head. "So I would like to propose a toast to Tyler and Alexandra." Her face now displayed what appeared to be a completely sincere and heartfelt smile. "May Tyler have the strength and patience to help Alexandra overcome her troubled past. May he possess enough love and compassion to accept a young woman who has faced so many personal challenges and made so many questionable decisions." Applause erupted throughout the room, but this time I could clearly distinguish the underlying tone. It was applause mixed with pity, the kind of polite response people give when they feel sorry for someone's unfortunate circumstances. It was the kind of clapping reserved for someone who was finally getting a chance at redemption, despite their many failures. Sarah returned to her seat, but I could sense that her performance was far from finished. I was struggling to process everything Sarah had just said, trying to determine how I should respond to such a public character assassination, when I noticed her hand moving toward the pocket of her uniform. In that moment, a chill of recognition ran down my spine. I knew exactly what she was planning to do next. Sarah slowly withdrew a clear evidence bag from her pocket. Under the warm lighting of the country club, the bag seemed particularly stark and ominous. Inside was a white powder, fine and evenly distributed, that looked exactly like what everyone would assume it to be. "I need to reveal a secret that I have been keeping hidden," Sarah announced, her voice suddenly becoming grave and heavy with the weight of official duty. She stood once again and walked back toward the microphone. "As a sworn law enforcement officer, my oath requires me to report any criminal activity that comes to my attention, even when the suspected criminal is my own beloved sister." The entire ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath in anticipation. "Yesterday," Sarah held the evidence bag high above her head for everyone to see clearly, "I went to Alexandra's apartment to help her pack some final items before the wedding. While I was helping her organize her belongings, I discovered this hidden in her bedside table." She elevated the bag toward the lights, ensuring that every single person in the room could see its contents clearly. "This is a controlled substance. I have already conducted a preliminary field test, and the results confirm that this is an illegal narcotic. This is what my sister has been hiding from all of us." The reaction was immediate and devastating. "Oh my God! This cannot be happening! I knew that girl had problems. A drug dealer? Right here in our community?" The whispers and exclamations crashed over me like a tsunami of judgment and disbelief. My mother, Linda, let out a small, heartbroken scream, and her champagne glass slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering against the table. The golden liquid spread across the white tablecloth like blood seeping from a wound. My father, Jim's face, turned ashen white, as if he had received a physical blow to the chest. He clutched his heart, appearing to struggle with the enormity of what he was hearing. "Alexandra." His voice trembled with a mixture of disbelief and crushing disappointment. "Is this true? Please tell me this is not true." Tyler jumped from his seat, his face a mask of confusion and growing anger. "What is this supposed to mean? Sarah, what are you talking about? This has to be some kind of mistake." Sarah's eyes locked onto mine, and I saw something in them that I could not quite identify. It was not pure hatred, nor was it simple triumph. Instead, it was something far more complex and disturbing, a mixture of emotions that bordered on madness. "I have been trying to protect this family's reputation for months," Sarah continued in her official law enforcement voice, "but I can no longer remain silent about criminal activity, even when the criminal happens to be my own flesh and blood. The law applies equally to everyone, regardless of their family connections." She reached for the handcuffs attached to her duty belt. The metal gleamed ominously under the ballroom's elegant lighting. "Alexandra Thompson," Sarah announced as she walked purposefully toward me, her voice now carrying the full authority of her official position. "You are under arrest for possession and distribution of controlled substances. You have the right to remain silent." "Wait just a minute." My father attempted to stand, but the shock had left him so weak that he nearly collapsed back into his chair. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law," Sarah continued, reciting the Miranda rights, her voice echoing throughout the country club like a formal pronouncement of judgment. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Do you understand these rights? Tyler immediately positioned himself between Sarah and me, his protective instincts overriding his confusion. Have you completely lost your mind, Sarah? This is insane. This is her engagement party. How can you possibly think this is appropriate? Step aside, Tyler, Sarah commanded, with the full authority of her law enforcement training, her professional demeanor completely overriding any trace of human compassion. This is a felony charge. I would hate to see you become involved in this situation as an accessory. I looked around the ballroom at 180 faces, 180 pairs of eyes, all focused directly on me. Some reflected shock, others disappointment, and many showed that particular combination of pity and disdain that I had become all too familiar with. Mayor Bob Hutchins had turned a deep shade of red, clearly embarrassed by his association with our family. Police Chief Martinez was shaking his head in what appeared to be disgust, as if he were looking at someone who had betrayed everything he stood for. Jessica, who had been my closest friend throughout high school, covered her mouth in horror, tears streaming down her cheeks. My mother Linda was crying inconsolably. My father Jim looked like a man who had lost everything he once believed in. Sarah approached me with her handcuffs ready for use. Are you really going to do this? I asked her, in a voice that was colder than a winter morning in the Texas Hill Country. In front of all these people? Is this really how you want this to unfold, Sarah? For just a moment, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross Sarah's features, but then her expression hardened with renewed determination. The law does not change based on circumstances or convenience, she replied firmly. She reached out roughly and grasped my arm, beginning to turn me around for the handcuffing procedure. Put your hands behind your back, she whispered in my ear, and this will be easier for everyone involved. Do not make this any more embarrassing than it already has to be. And at that precise moment, just as Sarah was about to secure the handcuffs around my wrists and transform me into a convicted criminal in front of everyone I cared about, something extraordinary happened. The main doors of the country club were violently thrown open. This was not a polite entrance or a gentle interruption. This was an aggressive, unmistakable demonstration of federal authority. Several black Chevrolet Suburban SUVs roared through the country club's security gate, their engines growling and their brakes screaming as they came to abrupt stops. The sound of tires grinding against the gravel parking lot cut through the afternoon air like a knife through silk. 1, 2, 3 vehicles. I counted 12 in total as they formed a semicircle around the main entrance. The doors of all 12 vehicles opened simultaneously, and armed federal agents emerged with military precision. They wore dark blue tactical vests with the letters DEA emblazoned in bright yellow across their chests. Each agent carried an MP5 submachine gun, but their posture was professional and controlled. Their weapons were held in a vertical position, indicating a readiness to act while not presenting an immediate threat. Their eyes were sharp and focused, displaying the unmistakable bearing of highly trained federal law enforcement professionals. The crowd scattered in panic. The neighbors who had been whispering and pointing just moments before were now screaming and running toward the interior of the country club for safety. The entire ballroom erupted in chaos and confusion. Sarah froze completely, still holding onto my arm, which was now connected to her handcuffs. Her entire body tensed as she tried to process this unexpected development. What is happening here? She stammered in bewilderment. The leader of this federal task force was a tall African-American man who appeared to be in his early 50s. He wore a perfectly tailored dark gray suit and I could see the outline of a shoulder holster beneath his jacket. He strode up the country club's front steps with absolute authority, his gaze sweeping across the crowd before locking directly onto Sarah and me. This was Special Agent Marcus Miller, my direct supervisor at the Drug Enforcement Administration. Federal Drug Enforcement Administration, Miller announced in a voice that commanded immediate obedience and could cut through any amount of screaming or confusion. Everyone remain exactly where you are. This is an official federal law enforcement operation. Do not move. Sarah frowned deeply. Although she was beginning to realize that something significant was happening, her instincts as a state trooper accustomed to being in command made her feel challenged and defensive. "I am Texas State Trooper Sarah Thompson," she announced in her most official voice, though I could detect uncertainty beneath her authoritative tone. "I have just lawfully arrested a suspect for narcotics possession. This is a local jurisdiction matter. What possible reason would federal agents have for being here?" Miller stopped directly in front of Sarah, but his attention was focused entirely on me. His next action sent shockwaves throughout the entire gathering. He straightened his posture and rendered a perfect military salute in my direction, despite the fact that I was handcuffed and appeared to be under arrest. This was the highest form of respect that a federal agent could show to a superior officer or distinguished colleague. "Agent Thompson," he said in a clear, authoritative voice that carried across the entire ballroom. "Welcome home. Operation Nightfall has been completely successful. Headquarters has ordered your immediate extraction for a comprehensive mission debriefing." The atmosphere became absolutely electric with shock and disbelief. I could see Mayor Bob Hutchins's mouth hanging open wide enough to catch flies. I watched my father's face cycle through confusion, shock, and then a slowly dawning comprehension. I saw tears forming in Tyler's eyes as he began to understand the magnitude of what was being revealed. I observed all the people who had been looking down on me just moments before, as their expressions changed completely in the span of seconds. Sarah let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh that sounded more like a shriek. "What are you talking about?" she demanded loudly. "She is a drug dealer. I personally discovered narcotics in her bedroom. Your intelligence must be completely wrong." Sarah pointed emphatically toward the evidence bag that she was still clutching in her free hand, the bag containing what everyone assumed to be illegal drugs. "This woman," Sarah screamed while pointing at me accusingly, "is my sister. And I know exactly what kind of person she is. She is an unemployed loser, a complete failure, "Remove those handcuffs immediately," Miller commanded Sarah in a tone that left absolutely no room for argument or discussion. "Absolutely not!" Sarah shouted back, her professional training completely overwhelmed by fear and desperation. "This is my prisoner. According to federal statute number—" "Officer Thompson," Miller interrupted her firmly, "if you do not remove those handcuffs immediately, I will be forced to arrest you for obstruction of justice, right now." Sarah's face turned deadly pale. She instinctively took a step backward, but 2 FBI agents had already positioned themselves near us. Their movements were gentle but utterly determined, displaying the controlled professionalism of highly trained federal operatives. One of the agents, a young man who appeared to be in his early 30s with the classic FBI agent appearance of short hair, penetrating eyes, and a lean build, extended his hand politely. "Officer Thompson," he said with a slight southern accent that made him sound less threatening, "I need you to remove those handcuffs immediately." I cannot," Sarah began to protest, but her voice was trembling noticeably. Miller stepped between Sarah and me, his imposing presence becoming particularly evident in this moment. "Sarah Thompson, State Police Inspector. Miller announced in the formal tone typically reserved for courtroom proceedings. You are under arrest for the following charges. First, obstruction of a federal agent in the performance of her official duties. Second, attempting to sabotage an ongoing major federal investigation. Third, harassment, intimidation, and public humiliation of a federal law enforcement officer. Fourth, unauthorized entry into the private residence of an undercover federal agent. Sarah's face changed from pale white to a sickly yellow color. You have no authority?" She began to protest weakly. Sarah, another FBI agent, approached, an older woman with steel gray hair who produced an official document. "This is an arrest warrant signed by a federal judge. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." At this point, Tyler crossed over the seating area and approached Miller directly, his face displaying complete confusion and growing fear. "Wait a minute," my fiancé said, his voice shaking with emotion. "What do you mean by federal agent? Alexandra is a—" He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with questions that he desperately needed answered. "I will explain everything later," I replied, my voice now carrying a completely different tone than he had ever heard from me before. This was calm, professional, and authoritative. This was the voice I had developed over the past 18 months, a voice that did not belong to the failed Alexandra that everyone thought they knew. Tyler looked as if he had been physically struck. He took several steps backward, staring at me as if I were a complete stranger. The FBI agents unlocked the handcuffs from my wrists. The sensation of freedom as the cold metal slid away from my skin allowed me to take my first deep breath in what felt like hours. I rubbed the red marks where the metal had pressed against my skin. Simultaneously, 2 other agents approached Sarah with genuine federal handcuffs in their hands. "No!" Sarah screamed desperately. "This is a setup. This woman, my sister, she has been deceiving us for years. She must have set me up. This is all an elaborate trap." "Sarah Thompson, please place your hands behind your back," one of the agents instructed in the calm, measured tone that has been heard countless times on police television shows. "No, I have to." Sarah turned desperately toward our father, Jim, her voice filled with panic and pleading. "Dad, tell them who I am. I am a police officer. I am a good person. I have been protecting this community for years." Jim's facial expression was indescribable. He looked like a man who had been cruelly awakened from what he thought was reality. He looked at Sarah, then at me, then at the evidence bag that had fallen to the ground, its white powder contents glittering under the country club's elegant lighting. "Jim," my mother Linda said, in a voice so small it was barely audible above the chaos. "What does this all mean?" No one answered her question immediately. The FBI agent successfully positioned Sarah's hands behind her back and secured them with federal handcuffs. The metallic clicking sound echoed across the country club's ballroom like the pronouncement of a final judgment. "Sarah Thompson," Miller continued in his formal prosecutorial voice, "you are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, a public defender will be appointed for you. Do you understand these rights?" This is all wrong," Sarah mumbled as they turned her around to face the crowd. "This is completely wrong." But no one was listening to her protests anymore. I watched as my sister was escorted away by the FBI agents. Her previously perfect ponytail was now disheveled and messy. Her crisp, pressed uniform was now covered with dust and grime from the country club's gravel. Tears were streaming down her cheeks. The woman I had once feared, once admired, once desperately tried not to disappoint, now looked exactly like what everyone had always believed me to be. She looked like a complete failure. When Sarah was loaded into one of the waiting black SUVs, the atmosphere at the country club had been completely transformed. Those who had been looking at me with sympathy and pity just minutes before were now turning their attention to Miller with expressions of awe and respect. The neighbors who had been whispering about me were now whispering about something entirely different, about Sarah Thompson and how completely wrong they had been about her character. Mayor Bob Hutchins rose from his seat, his face now flushed red, but this time not from sympathy, but from the embarrassment of realizing he had just publicly supported a corrupt police officer. Police Chief Martinez looked as if he had been hit by a brick truck. Derek, Sarah's former boyfriend, displayed an expression that defied description. He appeared simultaneously shocked and angry, realizing that he had nearly married someone who was being arrested by the FBI. Miller turned his attention back to me. Our eyes met, and he gave me a subtle nod that conveyed both confirmation and approval, a wordless, job well done gesture. Then he addressed the entire crowd gathered on the ballroom floor. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced in a clear, authoritative voice, "I am Special Agent Marcus Miller from the DEA Special Operations Division. I understand that this has been quite a shock for all of you." He paused to let the full weight of this revelation sink into everyone's consciousness. "I am here today because Alexandra Thompson is not a drug dealer. She is not an unemployed drifter. She is not a failure." I could see a glimmer of hope beginning to form on my mother's face. "Alexandra Thompson is one of the most courageous undercover agents in the United States Drug Enforcement Administration," Miller continued. "For the past 18 months, she has been working on an extremely dangerous assignment code named Operation Nightfall." A collective gasp of amazement echoed throughout the ballroom. "The purpose of this operation was to infiltrate the largest drug smuggling network in the Houston metropolitan area," Miller explained. "This network was controlled by a branch of the Mexican Sinaloa cartel and led by a drug kingpin named Marco Delgado." He allowed another pause for dramatic effect. "Alexandra Thompson risked her life on this assignment. She lived among real drug dealers. She participated in actual narcotics transactions. Every single day, she faced the possibility of being discovered and executed." Tyler approached me at this point. I could see tears forming in his eyes. You have always been," he began to say, struggling to find the right words. "Yes," I confirmed, my voice carrying a tone he had never heard before. This was the voice that belonged to a woman who had operated between life and death for 18 months. "However," Miller continued, his voice becoming even more serious, "while executing this mission, we discovered a significant problem. A very serious problem indeed." He allowed this pause to become uncomfortably long. Someone was leaking information from inside our organization. Someone was providing our operational plans to the drug dealers we were trying to capture. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. "We lost 2 outstanding federal undercover agents because of this betrayal," Miller said, his voice carrying the kind of grief that only comes from losing colleagues in the line of duty. Their names were David Chen and Roberto Martinez. Both had wives, both had children. Both lost their lives because of this internal betrayal. A young woman in the crowd began to cry. She was dressed in black, as if she had been attending a funeral rather than a wedding reception. "We spent 6 months tracking down the source of these leaks," Miller continued. The investigation was extremely difficult because this person was very careful and sophisticated in their methods. But eventually, we identified the traitor. Miller turned and pointed toward the SUV where Sarah had been taken. That person was Texas State Trooper Sarah Thompson. She had been providing information to the drug dealers about our raid plans, our investigative strategies, and the identities of our undercover agents. She did this in exchange for money, substantial amounts of money. My mother, Linda, let out a small cry of anguish. According to our investigation, Sarah Thompson received significant bribes from Marco Delgado's drug empire in exchange for this classified information. Derek turned and walked away at this point, clearly unable to process the fact that he had nearly married a corrupt police officer. "Now," Miller said, his voice becoming even more grave, "regarding today's incident." He gestured toward the country club's stage area. Sarah Thompson attempted to arrest a federal law enforcement agent on false drug possession charges in front of all these witnesses. This represents a very serious criminal act. This is an insult to our justice system. This is a direct attack on the rule of law in our country. Miller's gaze swept across the crowd. "I want all of you to understand that sometimes bad people look exactly like good people. Sometimes people wearing uniforms do not always represent justice. Sometimes real heroes are hidden in places where we cannot see them." He turned toward me with an expression of deep respect. "Alexandra Thompson," he said, with genuine reverence in his voice, "welcome back to the light." The next several hours passed in a blur of activity. FBI forensics teams processed the evidence bag, which turned out to contain nothing more than ordinary food-grade flour that Sarah had purchased from a Whole Foods grocery store 1 month earlier as part of her scheme to frame me. The other wedding guests were briefly interviewed by FBI personnel and then allowed to leave. Mayor Hutchins departed looking like a man who had been publicly humiliated, having just praised the courage and dedication of someone who was now under federal arrest. My parents were escorted to a private room where Miller and I joined them for a more detailed explanation. Tyler followed us, still looking completely lost and disoriented. "Jim and Linda," Miller began, his tone now more warm and personal, "I know this has been an enormous shock for both of you. I need to explain some important things that will help you understand what has happened here." My father sat heavily in a chair, looking 20 years older than he had that morning. "Jim, Linda," Miller continued, "you need to understand that in order for Alexandra's mission to succeed, we needed to create a complete cover story. A very believable, very convincing cover identity." "You mean?" my mother began, in a very small voice. "I mean that everything about Alexandra being considered a failure, an unemployed drifter, someone possibly involved with drugs, all of that was false. All of it was designed to protect her identity and ensure her safety." I could see understanding beginning to dawn on my father's face. "So all the disappearances," Jim said slowly. "Were part of the mission," Miller confirmed. "All the secrecy, all the things she could not tell you about, all the times you felt disappointed and betrayed by her behavior." I heard my mother begin to cry softly. "Linda," Miller said gently, "I know this is difficult to process, but I need you both to understand something crucial. Alexandra was not hurting you intentionally. She was protecting you." "Protecting us?" my father asked with confusion. "Yes," Miller explained. "If anyone had known that Alexandra was a DEA agent, then the drug dealers would have known as well. Your home, your address, your daily routines, all of that could have been used against her. Distance was necessary for your safety. Secrecy was absolutely essential." Tyler finally spoke up, his voice low and confused. "But why did you choose her?" he asked Miller. Why would you select an ordinary young woman for such dangerous work? Miller looked at me, then back at Tyler. Because she is anything but ordinary, he replied. Alexandra not only graduated from Georgetown University Law School, but she also completed training at the FBI Academy. She is one of the most talented young agents our department has ever encountered. Having a sister in law enforcement provided perfect cover for her activities. She possessed the intelligence, courage, and discipline necessary to execute this type of mission successfully. Miller paused thoughtfully. And most importantly, he continued, she loved her family and her country enough to endure being criticized and dismissed by everyone she cared about most. I watched my father's shoulders begin to shake with emotion. We were ashamed of you, he said through his tears. We thought you were— I know, I interrupted, moving to embrace him. I understand, but this was not your fault. You were never told the truth. His embrace was tight and desperate. I could feel his body trembling with grief and relief. During the following hour, Miller provided my parents with more detailed information about Sarah's involvement with the drug cartel. They sat in the country club's private dining room while Miller opened a thick file folder filled with surveillance photographs. These photographs were taken over the past 8 months, Miller explained as he showed them each image. This one shows Sarah meeting with Juan Carlos Hernandez, the cartel's second-in-command, at a roadside motel. This one shows her exchanging documents in a parking lot. This one shows— Each photograph felt like evidence in a criminal trial. According to our investigation, Sarah began making contact with the drug dealers approximately 3 months into Alexandra's mission, Miller explained. The cartel members knew she was a police officer. They approached her with an offer of money in exchange for information about our operations. Why would she agree to such a thing? My mother asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. Miller looked at me questioningly. Would you like to explain this part? He asked. I nodded slowly. Mom, Dad, I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. I need to tell you some things about Sarah that are going to be very difficult to hear. Both of my parents looked at me expectantly, waiting for an explanation that might help them make sense of this nightmare. Sarah always felt overlooked and underappreciated, I began. Despite accomplishing all the right things, getting the right job, receiving the right awards, dating the right people, she never received the level of recognition that she felt matched her achievements. But we were always proud of her. My mother started to protest. I know that, I said. But Sarah felt that I, despite being what everyone considered a failure, was somehow receiving more attention and concern from the family. You were always asking about me. What are you doing? How are you? Do you need help? Even though, from her perspective, I was accomplishing nothing and had no apparent future, I could see understanding beginning to form on my father's face. So when she began to suspect that I was involved in activities she could not understand, she thought she could use that information to her advantage, my father finished. Exactly, I confirmed. The cartel offered her money, substantial amounts of money. This gave her a sense of power and control. For someone who had always felt overshadowed by her sister's problems, despite her sister's apparent failures, this felt like a form of vindication. This information that Sarah provided, Miller said, picking up another document from the file, led directly to the exposure of 2 undercover agents. They were executed by the cartel members. Their bodies were disposed of by the drug dealers. I heard my mother gasp in horror. One agent's name was David Chen, Miller continued solemnly. He was from Sacramento. He had a wife and 2 young children. They no longer have a father because Sarah Thompson wanted money and a false sense of importance. The room fell into profound silence. "What will happen to Sarah now?" my father finally asked. "Multiple charges," Miller replied. "Bribery, conspiracy with a drug trafficking organization, obstruction of justice, contributing to bodily harm. In severe cases, potentially treason. She could face anywhere from 20 years to life imprisonment." My mother began crying again. "But she is our daughter," she said plaintively. "I understand," Miller said, his tone becoming more compassionate. "This is a tragedy, a complete family tragedy. Sarah made choices to betray her oath and her family. She chose greed over duty. These choices will have serious consequences." Over the following days, events unfolded in a chaotic but inevitable manner. Sarah was formally indicted and faced a lengthy list of federal charges. She was held without bail because federal prosecutors considered her a flight risk. Derek issued a public statement saying he was distancing himself from past poor judgment, which essentially meant he was ending their relationship. The media coverage exploded across Texas and beyond. Texas police officer betrays sister DEA agent. Undercover mission, female hero and corrupt sister story. Information leaks lead to agent deaths, officer charged with accepting bribes. Overnight, the Thompson family transformed from being known as one good daughter, one failure, to becoming the headline story of sisterly betrayal and federal agent heroism. My parents tried their best to adjust to this new reality. After that moment at the country club, they realized how completely wrong they had been in their judgment of me. But this realization brought not joy or redemption, but rather a heavy, overwhelming sense of guilt and regret. My father said to me one evening, "We should have believed in you. As your parents, we should have trusted you no matter what circumstances suggested." "Dad, you did not know the truth," I tried to comfort him. "No one was told what was really happening. This secrecy was necessary for everyone's safety." "But I said you were a—" His voice cracked with emotion. "I know," I said. "But now you know the truth. Now you can stop feeling guilty about the past." But they could not stop feeling guilty so easily. My mother struggled even more with this revelation. She had always considered caring for me to be her primary responsibility as a mother. Now she realized that during the time when I needed her support most, not only had she been unable to help me, but she had actually added to my burden. "I was a terrible mother," she said to me during one sleepless night. "No, you were not," I replied firmly. "You were a mother who was deceived by circumstances beyond your control. But you always loved me. Even when you thought I was a failure, you still loved me unconditionally." Tyler needed considerable time to adjust to learning that the woman he was about to marry was not just a troubled young woman, but rather a federally trained law enforcement agent who had been living among dangerous drug dealers for 18 months. "I need to know if you still love me," he said to me one day, "or if everything between us was just part of your performance." "Some of it was performance," I told him, giving him the most honest answer I could provide. In that world, I could not be completely myself. But my feelings for you were absolutely real. He did not look entirely convinced, but he accepted this explanation. Sometimes that is the best that life can offer. 6 months later, Sarah's trial began. I was required to testify as a witness for the prosecution. As I sat in the witness chair, I could see everyone in the federal courtroom. Sarah wore a gray prison jumpsuit and sat at the defendant's table. Her hair was no longer styled in a perfect ponytail, but was simply pulled back in a messy bun. Her face appeared pale and gaunt. She avoided making eye contact with me throughout the proceedings. "Please, tell the court," the federal prosecutor asked me. Your role in Operation Nightfall. I was an undercover federal agent, I replied in a calm, emotionless voice. My assignment was to infiltrate the drug smuggling network in the Houston area, establish trust with the criminals, gather evidence, and ultimately contribute to the prosecution of major drug traffickers. How dangerous was this assignment? The prosecutor continued. Extremely dangerous, I stated. I lived with real drug dealers. I participated in actual narcotics transactions. Every day I faced the possibility of being discovered and killed. During this mission, did you become aware that someone was leaking information about your operations? Yes, I confirmed. Approximately 6 months into the mission, we realized that our planned raids were being anticipated by the drug dealers we were trying to arrest. What were the consequences of these information leaks? The leaks led to the exposure and execution of 2 federal undercover agents, I said, maintaining my composure while everyone in the courtroom felt the gravity of my words. Who do you believe was responsible for these deaths? Sarah Thompson, I said, finally looking directly at my sister, even though she continued to avoid my gaze. She provided this classified information to drug dealers in exchange for monetary payment. Do you have anything you would like to say to your sister? I paused for a long time, studying Sarah's face. This was the woman I had once feared, once admired, once desperately tried not to disappoint in every aspect of my life. I want to say that I understand your feelings, I finally replied. I understand what it feels like to be overlooked. I understand the desire to be recognized and valued. But you chose the wrong path. You chose betrayal over loyalty. That choice affected not just your life, but the lives of everyone connected to you. I paused again. David Chen had a wife and 2 children. Roberto Martinez had a mother and 3 sisters. They lost their lives because of this betrayal. The silence in the courtroom was absolute and profound. I forgive you, I continued, because I must forgive you for my own mental health and peace of mind, but I want you to understand what you have lost. You have lost your family. You have lost a sister who once looked up to you. Emotion finally appeared on Sarah's face. Tears began streaming down her cheeks, but it was far too late for remorse to change anything. The trial lasted 3 weeks. In the end, Sarah was found guilty on all charges. She was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. When the judge announced the verdict, Sarah lowered her head in defeat. Her attorney, a public defender since she could not afford private legal representation, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. My father walked out of the courthouse after the sentencing hearing. His eyes were red and swollen from crying. "We have lost a daughter," he said to me sadly. "No," I corrected him. "Sarah is still alive, but she chose to separate herself from this family through her actions." "Can you ever truly forgive her?" my father asked, seemingly searching for some hope in this tragedy. "I have already begun the process," I replied. "But forgiveness does not mean forgetting what happened. Forgiveness does not mean pretending that none of this ever occurred." As we walked away from the federal courthouse that day, I realized that families can survive betrayal, but they are forever changed by it. Trust, once broken by such profound deception, can be rebuilt, but it will never be quite the same as it was before. Sarah had chosen her path, and now our family would have to learn to move forward without her, carrying both the love we once shared and the pain of her ultimate betrayal.